We begin our section on the foundations of American politics by reading some unusual sources of the concepts and practices that structure the various American political traditions. One common theme in the instruction of American political history begins with the Constitution and identifies the social contract theory that underlies it, a theory that in the English tradition is associated with Thomas Hobbes and especially John Locke, the thinker from whom Jefferson lifted the idea of life, liberty, and property that pervades the Declaration of Independence. We will give these thinkers their due, but before we examine these much esteemed philosophers, I want to draw attention to an equally important but often neglected source of American politics. The radical democratic currents that drove the key developments of the American Revolution, including the Constitutional Convention's desire to dam back these currents, are rooted in the 17th century revolutions that transformed British politics and society. Between 1640 and 1660, a cycle of civil wars shook British society to its foundations. In England, Ireland, Scotland, and the colonies in North America and the Caribbean, the old political order was overthrown, and a period of revolutionary experimentation laid the foundations for concepts related to the freedom of speech, religion, the press, and assembly. Most importantly, these civil wars produced democratic experiments that tested the limits of political possibility and established the principle of popular sovereignty in the center of the American political imagination. In 1640, the absolutist regime of Charles I came to blows with Parliament, the kingdom's assembly of notables that, uniquely at the time, limited the king's ability to tax his subjects. Charles tried to emulate his fellow monarchs in France and Spain, who exercised complete authority over their governments, with increasingly robust powers to extract wealth from society. But royal power in England, by comparison, had always been weaker than it was on the continent, and Charles' belligerent efforts to build an absolutist state in which his word would be law ran into ferocious opposition by new forces in Parliament. These middle-class, commercially oriented members of Parliament were primarily Puritans, whose opposition to Charles' absolutism was expressed as resistance to his religious claim that as head of the Church of England he was ordained by God to rule his subjects. The English Puritans were austere, radical Protestants who resisted the authority of the English church hierarchy. Since the church was part of the state, resistance was tantamount to treason. Intense state persecution led some of the most militant Puritans to flee the country, first to Amsterdam and then to Plymouth and New England, where Puritanism would become a foundational element of American culture. A religion of aspirational strivers from the middling classes, Puritanism gave Charles' opponents an ideological cohesion that allowed them to organize an armed challenge to the monarchy. Years of civil war convulsed England, Scotland, and Ireland, and at the close of the first period of struggle, Charles was captured by the victorious parliamentary forces. The revolutionary New Model Army, commanded by Puritan hardliners and full of soldiers with radical democratic ideas, became the real power in England, and it was based on the army's strength that parliamentary leaders led by General Oliver Cromwell proceeded to convict Charles for treason and then behead him. Now, nothing marks a modern revolution quite like the killing of a king, and Charles's death set off another round of warfare in which the English Commonwealth, a Puritan military dictatorship, fought to secure its rule against rebellion and invasion. Meanwhile, the fall of the monarchy set off a period of intense cultural activity that generated a host of new radical Puritan sects and a flood of sectarian literature, establishing the first standards for freedom of speech and freedom of the press as logical outcomes of the freedom of religious conscience that the revolution established. This cultural revolution would prove to be one of the most enduring changes of this period, and contributed mightily to slowly emerging concepts of liberalism. But in political terms, the revolutionary experiment ground to a halt in 1660 following the death of Cromwell, a mutiny in the army, and finally the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, son of the beheaded king. A further revolution in 1688, again a mass effort led by Parliament to curb an absolutist king, created the basic outline of the modern British state, in which Parliament is supreme and the monarchy's role is mainly symbolic. All three of today's readings were produced in the early, more radical phases of the English Revolution. Both the Putney debates and Gerard Winstanley's Digger Manifesto were products of the end of the First Period in Civil War, in 1647 and 1649, respectively. By then, parliamentary forces had decisively defeated the Royalists, and King Charles was a prisoner in London. For the first time in centuries, there was a void at the center of British political life, a disturbing absence that leached away long-held habits of obedience and deference that upheld the existing hierarchies of rich and poor, orthodox or dissenter, free or unfree. To be sure, kings had been overthrown before, but there was always a new claimant ready to take the throne. Often there were too many claimants, and medieval civil wars in Britain were defined by struggles among the nobility to build coalitions strong enough to back a given family's claim to the throne. But when the Puritan armies of Parliament captured Charles, they did not propose to replace him with his son. They did not propose to replace him at all, and here lies the truly revolutionary significance of this historical moment. The New Model Army was an army built under the pressure of war. When fighting broke out in 1640, it followed the traditional English model, in which local notables raised amateur armies to fight locally on behalf of either the king or parliament. This kind of loose militia system, a familiar factor in American military history, was unsuited for a long, grueling war, and the New Model Army was designed to provide a much-needed, steady professionalism. The discipline that marked the army was based on the enthusiasm of the volunteers who filled its ranks. Many of the rank and file came from middling Puritan backgrounds, and they were committed to a mix of popular radicalism and religious zeal that made them a formidable force in conditions of social breakdown. In fact, the New Model Army in 1647 occupied a singular position well known to scholars of revolution. They held the balance of power in their hands. The monarchy and the aristocracy were discredited, the people were war-weary and desperate for peace, and Parliament itself was just a collection of long-winded gentlemen whose power depended upon the army. So, while Parliament in principle might have been the supreme authority in the land, real power lay in the barracks, and the soldiers of the New Model Army knew it. The dominant political faction in the army was the Levelers. The term denoted their supposed desire to wipe away social distinctions, to level the social hierarchy and establish a democracy. The Levelers drew their strongest support from men who came from artisanal urban backgrounds and were either Puritans or members of other dissenting Protestant groups. Their demands for an early kind of universal suffrage, in which all male heads of households could vote for their member of parliament, might not seem radical to us. But in 1647, the idea that all male residents of Britain had a right to choose who should govern them, who should have power over them, was astonishing. It could only be publicly expressed because the old order had been violently destroyed, and the champions of revolutionary transformation were the ones with the guns. The army's leveler radicalism was expressed in the Agreement of the People, a proposed written constitution for England devised by the soldiers of the New Model Army. Under this system of rule, the monarchy would be abolished and Parliament would hold all political power. Parliament would be elected every year in free and fair elections open to all men, who would also enjoy freedom of conscience and religion. This radicalism frightened not only the defeated factions of the Civil War, but also the upper ranks of Parliament and the army. The officers in command of the New Model Army were committed Puritans, but they were no Democrats. They were as likely to come from the junior ranks of the aristocracy as they were the propertied middle classes, and in neither case would they have welcomed the loss of status and privilege that real democracy would entail. But the officers, like the men of Parliament, were outnumbered by the soldiers, and if discipline was to be maintained, the radicalism in the ranks had to be managed. So, in another striking example of revolutionary change, Parliament and the Army High Command held a series of debates with representatives from the ranks at Putney in the fall of 1647. The Army's officers, represented at Putney by Commanding General Oliver Cromwell and his deputy and son-in-law, General Henry Ireton, balked at the universal male suffrage demand of the Army, represented here by Colonel Thomas Rainsborough. The debates ended with a qualified admission by the High Command that it would consider the agreement as the basis for a constitutional settlement. But support for the Levelers ebbed as Parliament paid off and disbanded parts of the army and put down mutinies among the most radical troops. This internal conflict was temporarily suspended by the escape of King Charles, his recapture, his trial and execution, which in turn set off another round of wars. These wars tightened the grip of the anti-Leveler factions in Parliament and the army, and the democratic aspirations voiced at Putney were forced back underground, either in England or in exile in America. Leveler politics never gained a foothold in the Puritan regime, and its activities were suppressed after the Restoration. But as a tradition among lower-class agitators and middle-class sectarians, Leveler ideas traveled around the Atlantic world and emerged in the American Revolution, the Irish Rebellion of 1798, and the Democratic Chartist movement of the 1840s. While the prospect of radical Leveler soldiers dictating peace terms alarmed the traditional ruling elite, it was the fringe movement dubbed the Diggers that provoked an immediate violent response. While this was in part due to the fact that the Diggers were a very marginal sect, it was also the case that Digger beliefs excited a uniquely furious response among the upper classes. The Diggers called themselves true Levelers, but as is so often the case, a mocking nickname became the historically accepted term. But as their preferred name suggests, the Diggers were an offshoot of the Levelers, drawn from the most precarious ranks of British society, men who, when not under arms, were either migrant laborers or apprentices. If the Levelers were forerunners of modern concepts of popular sovereignty and representative democracy, then the Diggers may be seen as early forms of anarchists. The Levelers wanted to give every man the right to vote, whether he held property or not. The Diggers wanted to do away with private property altogether. Many Diggers had been the victims of enclosure, the centuries-long process in which English common land, available for anyone to use, was fenced in and converted into the private property of an individual, either an existing landlord or an up-and-coming, cash-rich merchant. This process was vital for generating the capital stock needed to fuel the expansion of capitalist economics, and later to finance the Industrial Revolution. But this progress was paid for with the destruction of an entire way of life that uprooted communities and separated people from direct control of the land they relied on. The enclosure movement had accelerated in the decades leading up to the English Revolution, a trend which produced a dispossessed and desperate class of laborers attracted to Gerard Winstanley's vision of a communal utopia, in which men would find fellowship by cooperative work on land held in common. Winstanley's motivations mingled the political and the religious, as his anarchist experiments were founded on a deep Christian faith that mingled impulses to brotherly love with enthusiasm for a final conflagration that would establish God's kingdom on earth, a realm of perfect justice. This direct challenge to the concept of property itself drew swift reprisal. Wherever Digger colonies sprung up, local landowners assembled militias to root them out by force. This was typically done with the help, either passive or active, of the parliamentary regime, which was eager to establish a new political consensus and would not tolerate open radicalism of this sort. Throughout the English Revolution, there was a recurrent tension that would appear in all other modern democratizing revolutions, including the two American revolutions of 1763 to 1789 and later 1860 to 1877. When Parliament defeated King Charles, it found that the revolutionary energies that it had harnessed to win the war were no longer helpful. In fact, increased radicalism threatened to spin out of control and endanger the very existence of the parliamentary regime. So in the name of consolidating the revolution, its most extreme advocates were suppressed in favor of a new regime that promised stability. These same conflicts emerged in the revolution that created the United States. The protest movement against British rule united middle-class reformers with working-class radicals, an alliance that persisted throughout the War of Independence, but fell apart in the 1780s, when economic hardship prompted resistance that recalled Leveler and Digger ideals. It was with these threats in mind that the framers of the Constitution met in 1787 to create a framework for a reformed republic insulated from dangerous democratic disturbances. Finally, let's look at Thomas Morton's New English Canaan. Morton was a witness to a peculiar and portentous moment in the earliest history of New England. The Puritan settlers of New England were not pioneers by nature. They were the most committed of the English dissenters who, before the outbreak of the Revolution, were legally forbidden to believe or worship as they chose. Most Puritans were either townspeople or landed gentry, used to the standards and practices of civilized life in 17th century England. But New England was a wilderness, full of strange flora and fauna, with harsh weather and challenging terrain, and inhabited by strange, utterly alien peoples. The settlers' aim to rebuild English society in a new world was confronted by sickness, hunger, and violence, and life on the New England frontier became a remorseless struggle for survival, in which English settlers, convinced of their divine mission, wrested control of the land from native tribes made desperate by plague and invasion. When we think of Puritan New England, we think, not incorrectly, of religious and social conflict, warfare, hardship, and periodic outbreaks of violent hysteria. This tradition is embedded deeply not just in American culture in general, but in American political ideals as well. What Morton shows us is a possible alternative to the Puritan leaders' vision of an orthodox, authoritarian New England that lived in a permanent state of war with the native peoples. Morton was a Protestant lawyer and writer who in his youth ran in the same theatrical circles as Shakespeare. Morton traveled to the Puritan colonies in Massachusetts as a business agent for royal interests, and while there, he was struck by the intense beauty of the land and the practices of the natives. This enthusiasm for America was balanced by a dislike of the intolerant and belligerent attitudes of the Puritan leadership. Morton moved to Massachusetts to serve as the resident agent of a plantation at Mount Wollaston. Morton oversaw trade with the natives and the labor of indentured servants bound to the plantation. When Morton found that the plantation's owner was planning to sell the servants into slavery in Virginia, he encouraged them to revolt. This they did, and Morton became the de facto leader of a community of rebel servants and local natives that he renamed Merrymount. Merrymount became notorious as a town in which English and natives mingled freely. It was not religiously organized, and, to the supreme horror of the Puritans, the English at Merrymount began to adopt native customs and practices. To the Puritans, this signaled the degeneration of the Christian soul in the wilderness, under the lure of the devil and his native servants. But the Merrymount English sensibly recognized that native ways were adapted to conditions of life in New England, and thus a surer way of securing food, shelter, and so on. In turn, this provided much time for leisure and socializing, which directly contradicted the Puritan dogma that hard, constant work was a good in and of itself. The Puritan authorities called the place Mount Dagon, in imitation of the Philistine idol in the Bible, and moved to arrest Morton and break up the settlement. Morton ultimately returned to England and wrote this book as a memorial to this brief experiment in a different kind of new world. This short interlude of interracial libertarianism stands at the head of a long and rich tradition of American utopianism, of a political current that celebrates the potentials inherent in a new world, where human institutions can be made to serve the people rather than exploit them. This tradition, as much as the formal theories of the philosophers, informs the American political imagination.